Greetings, this is MBA 522, Decision Making in Organizations, and this lecture is covering all of the beginning ethical information, learning the basics about ethics, and then diving in a little bit deeper into the ethical theories that we will be using to consider dilemmas in the class. So why, basically, do we understand ethics? What is the purpose of understanding business ethics specifically? In the field of philosophy, it's obviously one of the main areas that you want to be studying, sort of people's ethical behavior, why they behave the way that they do. It's important to understand this in the context of business for a whole host of reasons, which is what we're going to get into in this first little lecturette on your introductory lectures on what is ethics and why it matters. So the big issue around business ethics is, how do we know that something is right or wrong? And fundamentally, we don't, because there are things that are okay under the law and are illegal under the law. But beyond the law, it is a little bit more challenging to understand what is considered right, what is considered wrong. The world is far more gray and rainbow colored than it is clearly black and white. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some things that aren't clearly black and white. But even in what we might agree is probably the most simplistic example, that it's wrong to kill somebody, we recognize that under certain circumstances, we may not have a choice. For example, the trolley car example that you heard in earlier in some lectures and some reference in some of the books that you've been reading. Is it wrong to kill one person when the only other option is you would kill 5 people versus killing one person? In that circumstance, you could say, well, no, of course it's not wrong to kill somebody. If the choice is between killing one person and killing 5 people, is it also an issue that if we are in war, is it okay to kill somebody during war? And, of course, there are larger moral issues. Is war okay? Is war a moral thing? And many would argue that war is immoral. But outside of that view, if you were actually to simply look at killing within the context of war, is it unethical? And many would argue, no, of course not, it isn't. What about killing in self-defense? Is that okay? And so we might think that killing somebody is a really black and white issue, that it is either right or it's wrong. And in fact, it's far more complex than that. There are all shades of gray and all sorts of rainbow colors that we have to consider when we're thinking about whether or not it's okay to kill somebody. And therein it lies some of the challenges that we have with ethics. We might, at our gut, say, I think this is right, but the person sitting next to you is going to say, well, no, that's absolutely wrong, because you come from baseline assumptions that are very different, core values that are different. And so when we look at what is right and what is wrong, it becomes challenging for people in a room to agree what is the right or the moral thing to do, or what is the wrong or immoral thing to do. And so what we're going to be thinking about is really, how do we define what business ethics are? Why do we care about it in the context of the business environment? And then we'll get into some of the theories about how to think about ethical cases and ethical analysis. So here in our next slide, we're exploring, why do we explore ethics in business? I mean, we understand why we explore it in the land of philosophy, but why does it matter in the business context? Because what we know historically is ethics failures are business failures. And so if a company has a corrupt ethical culture, if it is disintegrating because of poor behaviors, political behaviors, people who are engaging for their own self-interest, you will find that the business will fail ultimately. It may not in the short term, but over time, the smoke and mirrors upon which the business is resting will collapse and the company will fall apart. And you can see, I mean, there's been research that's been done on these particular issues, and one particular company studied 60 high-profile European businesses and found, as it says there, while 63% failed for reasons related to economic issues or, risk, that's essential and a big part of entrepreneurship, 37% collapsed due to fraudulent behavior. That's 1/3 of those businesses that have fallen apart. That's pretty profound if you think about it. 1/3 of the businesses out there in the world will collapse because of fraudulent or unethical behavior on the part of one or many people in the company. And typically what happens in that situation is there isn't a structure where there is an ethical framework for people to work within. And we talked already about compliance in this class, but it's more than just the compliance issues, right? Compliance helps us to some extent, but that doesn't always stop people from behaving unethically. It just means that when they're caught, they're going to be punished pretty heavily. What stops people from behaving unethically is hiring people with integrity and making sure that you've got a culture and an infrastructure that reinforces better and more ethical behaviors in that situation. So again, exploring why we have to look at ethics in business. People who work in organizations are the ones that are creating the unethical behaviors. It's not the organization in and of itself, because it's just an entity on paper for all intents and purposes. But it's the employees that work within that organizational structure that are behaving in a way that's inappropriate or illegal or unethical. And they are often influenced by the environment around them. And so if you work in an industry where corruption is fairly high and runs rampant, then it's very likely that you'll engage in those behaviors too. If your coworkers engage in unethical behaviors, you will be influenced by that and are more likely to also engage in those behaviors. Again, part of it is because of sort of this ethical fading, this idea of ethical fading, which is that, after a while we sort of look at things and go, it's not so bad. Well, if they're doing it, it's probably okay, I can do that. And ethical fading can really hurt us over the long run because we stop being sensitized to ethical issues. Emerging leaders really need to focus on managing ethical behaviors in their organization, because again, that spillover effect, if I do it and then you do it and then the top management team does it and then my customers do it and they do it in their business, and it really spreads fairly far, when we start to get desensitized to these issues. So you should lead by example. And if you don't want others to engage in unethical behaviors, particularly those that are reporting to you or that you work with in a close collaborative way, it's really important that you make sure you behave in a way that's above board, that you engage in the appropriate behaviors as need be. The job of us in this class is not to teach you how to be ethical. You already know what your ethical code is. You already know what your values are. The job that I have in this class is to introduce you to ways of thinking about your ethics, thinking about how to utilize your ethics to make better decisions, how to make better ethical decisions in considering all of our stakeholders and considering what your core values are and considering multiple opportunities so that you don't fall victim to decision-making biases that may lead you to unethical behaviors. I love this cartoon because, here people are taking an ethics test and asking the question, how important are ethics in today's society? And of course, they're all cheating off the person who's writing the answer to the test. So there goes your answer to how important is ethics in today's society. It is important. It's absolutely important. It's absolutely important in the context of academic integrity, and making sure that you are honest in the work that you do so you get an honest reflection of the work that you put into your coursework. And it's the same thing in your business environment. You want an honest reflection of what you are capable of doing, not an inflated one, because that inflated one eventually will disintegrate and will fall apart. So if you're pretending that you know something, or you're pretending that you're doing something right, and in fact you're doing it illegal, ultimately that does catch up to you and becomes problematic. So ethics has two fundamental components. It has what we call an internal compass and an external compass. Our internal compass is the nagging internal Jiminy Cricket conscience. For those of you that like Disney, Jiminy Cricket was Pinocchio's conscience. And it's that conscience, that internal voice that tells you that something is right or something is wrong. And it's sort of this notion of, can I look myself in the mirror, and do I see somebody that I have faith in, and that I am comfortable with the way that I behave every single day. So we are judging our own actions, and we harshly judge our own actions. And so many people have a very strong and well-developed internal compass. But that internal compass, interestingly enough, is not something that just pops up inside of people. Internal compasses come from external influences. And so our internal and our external compass, are guided, and work interchangeably. Our external compass is when we are looking to others for judgment. For example, I look at my peers, and I want to know what my peers think of me, or what my boss thinks of me, or what my church thinks of me, or my God thinks of me, if you are a religious person. And so in all these situations, it's the external judgment that guides the way we behave. And oftentimes, and I've heard this from people who are deeply religious, which I absolutely respect, they say, how can you be ethical or moral without a God? And you can, because we can be influenced not necessarily by the idea of a God, or that a God will tell us what to do or how to do it, but that we are greatly influenced by those around us, and helping us to determine what is right or what is wrong. And perhaps those others are guided by a belief in a higher being, God or Allah, or whoever that might be. But ultimately, I don't look for external validation. I look for internal validation, and I'm going to develop my own values based on my experiences in life and how I want to be treated, and how it makes me feel when I do something bad, or when I do something wrong, or when I do something right. And I build my own internal compass based on my internal values. And so people can choose to be guided primarily by what their inner voice tells them, or they can be guided by that external voice. And there's no right or wrong answer to that. In many respects, these things, as I said, become very intertwined. Internal compass effects, external effects, internal, etc. So the most important thing here is to recognize that there is no right voice or right compass that you should be looking to, but recognize that both of those things are influencing the ethical norms and decisions and values that you make every day. Ethics asks us a core fundamental question about our human values, which is, how should we live our lives? And that's really what ethics is trying to answer. And we should live our lives consistent with the ethical lens, the ethical norms that we think are important to us. So ethics is what we ought to do or what we should do, but it's not always about how we actually behave. And so there's a really big difference between what we should be doing and what we actually are doing. And our goal is, of course, we want to make those two things as consistent as possible. Not only should we be doing it, but we actually are doing it at the same time. What we ought to do is based on a whole host of different things. It's based on our core values, or sort of this common sense of what is right or wrong. And there is a fundamental common sense idea of what is right and what is wrong. I think for most people, there's a lot of evidence that there is that we don't have a blank slate, but that we have a fundamental core set of values that get developed over our lifetime even more and more. Social conventions, our friends, our families, our societies, our communities, our religious groups, our country, our nations, our states, if you're here in the United States. So all of these things influence the norms that we experience, and sometimes we agree with those norms, and sometimes we disagree with those norms. Sometimes we like our norms, and we don't like the norms of other countries, and that's, it's a big part of the challenge of living in a pluralistic society where there are many ways of viewing the world and many ways of experiencing the world, that we oftentimes forget that there isn't one right way to experience the world. But even as we continue to think about other ways that we ought to live or we should live, we have to think about corporate values, corporate norms, what the company culture is like, what our country and national country values, national culture. And then, of course, then you have things in a larger sense, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. This was agreed upon in the UN after World War II. Eleanor Roosevelt, who used to be the First Lady, worked very hard to develop this Declaration of Human Rights and to get many signatories on it. And the goal of this Declaration of Human Rights was that we look to certain fundamental rights that no matter where you live, no matter who you are, no matter what color you are, what race you are, what ethnicity, what religion, what sex, what orientation, fundamentally you have some fundamental human rights. And that list of human rights is pretty profound. And if you have an opportunity, you should look up what those human rights are. Ultimately, every time we are faced with a dilemma, faced with a situation, we make an ethical judgment. We're taking all the data in. We have to think about, given the circumstances, is this behavior right or is this behavior wrong? Is this behavior good? Is this behavior bad? And we have to make that judgment and individually to determine whether or not something is ethical. This aspect of how we should live our lives really comes down to personal responsibility and personal accountability. Ethical theories help explain how we behave or how we systematically should behave based on some of those ethical issues and ethical frames. And ultimately, given the variety of frames within which to think about morality, to think about ethical behaviors, we recognize that we have choices to make, and we can make choices that are ethical and good. At a minimum, we can have a decision process, an ethical analysis, a dilemma resolution that is ethical, has integrity, that we work to remove bias, that we work very hard to try to see both sides of an issue. So even if the outcome may be challenged, people may disagree with your outcome, you can demonstrate that you used a good process to really think about something deeply and to think about whether or not the decision is going to have a negative or a positive impact. And I think that's the key thing. It's about the choices that we make. We have choices that we can make freely, and it's the choices that we make that really do influence the lenses that we use and the way that we are reflected as ethical people.